Welcome to the IEAI speaker series this week. This month we have a treat. We have 4 speakers for you, and we're covering a really exciting and more discussed topic right now of AI and human rights. Business enterprises are increasingly recognized as entities responsible for upholding human rights. However, the growing integration of AI across various business sectors raises questions about how existing corporate human rights responsibilities should be implemented in relation to these technologies. Moreover, as we saw, I think even last week from the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, he made the statement that the questions before us today is what are the limits for artificial intelligence and emerging technologies? These are one of the most pressing challenges faced by society, governments, and the private sector. While policy approaches, like he goes on to demonstrate something I think a lot of us have been thinking about, that while policy approaches have heavily focused on risk-based assessments that transfer a lot of mitigation and assessment responsibilities to developers and deployers of AI, a human and fundamental rights approach to governance has come increasingly into the conversation, even in just recent weeks, I'd say. So questions are, what might this approach look like? How do we integrate the entire human rights agenda into the AI life cycle, all aspects of it? How do we practically and effectively run human and fundamental rights assessment or tools? And how do we make sure they're available and they work? How can we reconcile the current risk-based approaches with human rights-based approaches in AI governance? These are just some of the questions we hope to cover today. And we have a diverse panel here to talk about different aspects of it. So we're going to start with 4 short presentations by our panelists, and then we'll come up and do a question round. So if you have more broader questions to the discussion, please save them for the panel. If you have clarification questions to a person's specific presentation, we can do some short questions at the end of each presentation. So I'm going to invite up Alex Kriebitz. He's a postdoctoral researcher at TUM, come on up, at the Institute for Ethics in AI, which is the host of today. Event. His research focuses on corporate responsibilities concerning human and fundamental rights considerations throughout the AI lifecycle, looking at frameworks such as the IEAI Act, the UN Global Compact, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Alex, floor is yours.
So thank you, Caitlin, for introducing me, and good afternoon. So basically, my presentation today will be some kind of general overview about the issues we are going to touch upon today. So in a sense, the wider implications of corporate human rights responsibilities in the context of artificial intelligence, understood as a process of AI development, but also a process of AI use. And to this end, in today's presentation, I will basically cover 2 different points. So one point is why we actually need to embed human rights considerations in the context of artificial intelligence. And secondly, what we can basically do to turn that into practice. So those are, in a way, the 2 points, in a way, the problem statement and the solution to that question. So what are we currently observing? We see that companies that are the drivers of AI development and deployers are the ones that are struggling with realizing AI ethics. So although we have a lot of research and a lot of papers in a way that speak about the necessity of performing AI ethics-based assessments or mitigation measures, we still see that there are a lot of companies actually laying off staff when it comes to AI ethics or AI ethics teams. And to understand that is a major issue. So usually if companies lay off staff and decide to divest from a specific sector, it implies that they don't see a strong return on invest in doing so. And basically over the last years and months, we encountered that this is due to 4 different channels. The first channel is that AI ethics as a concept is quite vague, as ethics itself is. We have different ideas about what is right and what is wrong, depending on our point of view. We have also, interculturally speaking, major differences and divides when it comes to the question of what we actually want to achieve when dealing with a technology such as artificial intelligence. Moreover, AI in itself is a complex technology. We have the issue of biases, we have the issue of privacy, we have also the issue of settling very difficult ethical dilemma situations. Moreover, we have, apart from the difficulty of establishing general code of conducts, the difficulty in breaking that down to the multiple use cases of artificial intelligence. As identified in the European AI Act, AI is not just one technology. In fact, it is a family of different technologies which have multiple normative implications in the context of health, in the context of autonomous driving, also in the context of human resources. So the implications are complicated, and in some sectors, we are just trying to understand what is at stake when developing AI in a given context, such as it is in the case of mental health AI solutions, for example. Apart from that, we have a range of competing ethical framework, including the G20, including the OECD, including UNESCO, including IEEE and whatnot. So we have basically this plethora of different ethical frameworks, and companies have difficulties in deciding where basically they go into in order to streamline their strategies to AI ethics. Finally, we have the issue that AI ethics is a concern not just of one corporate function, but in fact, it deals with compliance, it deals with the ones that program AI solutions. It also involves the business development function. And those kind of business departments, they are always different when it comes to sectoral issues. For example, when you look at the case of AI solutions deployed in the context of health, where also medical affairs plays a much more important role in regulatory oversight. So these are issues in a way impeding the realization of AI ethics in practice. However, we see at the same time, we could argue that, well, if it is difficult to implement, let's not just do it in a way. So this is in a way the devil's advocate arguing here for perhaps really divesting from that. But if we do so, it would come at significant social costs. And to give you some examples, I will state some problem statements that we have already seen in which form whatsoever. So the first case is about a German car manufacturer using AI solutions for pre-selecting candidates for a job interview. So in this theoretical case, what kind of issues could I come up? Logically, it's about biases mainly. We have seen in our research that biases are not just covering the groups which we traditionally identify in the current discourse on discrimination as relevant in an AI ethics context, but sometimes we also have traditional biases as understood in research that is going on at our chair, where we see that also Jewish surnames can be associated still in our present world to stereotypes. Also then realizing or resulting again in discrimination based on AI because of historical data sets being used in a given context. So this is also likely not to be seen in many cases by the ones developing and deploying those AI solutions. At the same time, we have the issue of inclusion. So currently we have many plans to roll out AVs in the context of public services, in the context of local transit authorities. However, one key issue is that they might fail to detect movement patterns of individuals with disabilities. Because usually if you train an AI model, you might take the average population, but you have populations that behave differently because they can't see, for example. There's a case which actually happened in Japan, where an AV was unable to detect specific movement patterns of individuals with visual impairments. So here we see that through specific hardware solutions that might fail to detect specific groups, or also when we look at software models and so on and so forth, or data which is used for training an AI model, that we have specific risks broken down by vulnerable populations. At the same time, we have the issue of repurposing AI. So we have a lot of investment in AI technology when it comes to the health sector. We have seen it already with COVID-19, that there is a purpose of using AI in order to detect transmission routes of diseases, in order to understand how they will unfold in future, and also to establish mitigation measures against them. So it is likely also to be deployed in the context of AIDS, which is also currently a concern of research. At the same time, if you deploy it in countries which have different standards, when it comes to the rights of LGBTQ plus population, risks of repurposing such software solutions are extremely high, as demonstrated with the current legislation approach in Uganda in the Act Against Homosexuality. So here we see basically that a technology which is meant to help individuals could be repurposed. This is an issue in human rights literature and in the AI ethics context, which is not so much touched upon, in difference to the previously mentioned two cases. So there is a need to prevent such cases from the beginning, and also to have mitigation measures that are addressing those risks when deploying and using AI, touching upon general corporate human rights responsibilities, also the responsibility to continue due diligence processes, also when it comes to AI as a technology. So major instrument of that is integrating human rights in instruments that are already enforcing AI ethics. The key reason is incentives. We still see that companies don't really want to enforce AI ethics on a voluntary basis, although some of them are doing. It is not a phenomenon which is applicable to all companies. So AI legislation has the purpose to define fines for companies violating ethical standards, but they are also determining market entry barriers for sector-specific AI solutions, such as we know them from the context of autonomous vehicles, but also from the context of health, where we can integrate such human rights standards early on. So why is it human rights to use as a principle to enforce that? Basically, we have 4 different channels of doing so. The underlying reason is that human rights are not just an ethical principle, but also a legal one. So they have this genus-faced role of looking into law, but at the same time also looking into ethics. Furthermore, we have 4 general arguments supporting that. Human rights are the baseline of our constitutions in form of so-called fundamental rights, applicable to Germany, but also to the EU constitution. Moreover, they are a fundamental principle of international law through customary international law, but also through major international conventions, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Moreover, human rights are understood increasingly context-dependent. So in the years following the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we have context-specific treaties, such as the codifications of the WHO on the right to health, but also the International Convention on the Rights of Individuals with Disabilities, then also enabling companies to know what kind of human rights considerations are at stake in a given use case. Moreover, we have also the understanding, the increasing understanding, that human rights considerations are applicable to companies. The major instruments can be found in the business and human rights discourse, for example, the UN Global Compact, but also the UN Guiding Principles. This is also much more enforced by the ongoing debate on a European taxonomy, which is then defining sustainability in terms of ESG, but also adjacent legislation. So this makes it much more important for companies to adhere to social standards when it comes to finance and also when it comes to access to capital markets. Finally, we see that human rights is increasingly embedded in AI-specific legislation. So if we look at the risk pyramid of the IEAI Act, we see that human rights considerations are mainly applicable to the unacceptable risk definition, where we have AI solutions that are inherently conflicting with fundamental rights, or we have higher risk defined AI solutions where specific normative principles need to be considered, specific fundamental rights. Moreover, the IEAI Act calls upon developing an AI-based risk assessment, which revolves around fundamental rights. So here we have the final connection of fundamental and human rights considerations into EU AI-specific legislation. So the key question is how to deal with that. So when we look at a state of literature based on the IEAI Act, but also on the UN Guiding Principles, we have the idea of performing a risk assessment in terms of AI solution, but also the idea of establishing due diligence and mitigation measures, also including corporate reporting practices on risks and mitigation measures. So the key point is here how to implement that in practice, and also when thinking about highly complicated AI solutions for a specific case. So over the last months, we had the fortune to look into implementing such standards in the context of health. So in our EU-funded project, Melissa, we looked into how to apply AI ethics concepts, but also fundamental rights considerations in the context of AI development. And the project is simply about the self-treatment for individuals with diabetes. So the idea is basically to help them to monitor the levels, but also to understand and support them in the function of carb counting. If you know individuals that have diabetes, you will understand that both issues are critical for them in order to understand also certain risks that are posed by hypo or hyperglycemia, which are very uncomfortable states for individuals. So it is critical because the wrong handling of such an application can really entail high risks for individuals in terms of realizing the right to health, but also the right to bodily and mental integrity. So what we were basically doing is a normative approach to understand first the norms that are at stake in a given use case. Most of them come naturally from the context of health, including the idea of self-determination of patients. So this is helpful for understanding the implications of explainability, because the emphasis of AI in health is to have conditions reinforcing the idea of informed consent, that individuals that are exposed to AI fully understand the implications of the software solutions to them and what it actually means. So the idea of understanding plays a critical role in this context. Also the right to equitable health, which means that the performance of health systems should not be biased or discriminating against individuals because of their biological sex or because of age and other factors. So there is much more stronger pressure to realize similar performances of an AI solution for different demographic groups. Moreover, we have the right to physical and mental integrity, which means that systems need to be sufficiently robust and also explainable for individuals so that they basically can understand risks posed by the systems they are facing. So based on that, we developed mitigation principles revolving around the risks we have detected. One key risk is the risk of biases, which is quite a universal one in the context of AI. However, when it comes to the medical field, we often have correlations between medically relevant data on the one side and on the other side, also certain group characteristics. So to give you one example, hormone levels are different based on biological sex, but also based on age. If you don't consider such aspects, you will have tremendous performance variances based on biological sex and age, which would then conflict with human rights considerations. Moreover, we have the issues posed by data privacy and also the main idea of medical confidentiality, which is reinforcing norms protecting individuals from sharing data to other parties in this particular context. So these are just some broad recommendations we developed for programming the AI solutions. But one critical aspect is this overlap between medical factors on the one side and on the other side, criteria regarded as discriminatory, but also particular foresight for individuals that are at high risk, for example, individuals that are driving and basically that might have an insulin shock before doing so. So here explainability again plays a significant role. So basically what the purpose of the presentation is to illustrate that the considerations for human rights are really practically relevant for the design of AI solutions. Moreover, we find that there is an increasing pressure in legislation to realize human rights through different channels, which might be sector-specific, but also comprehensive legislation, such as the IEAI Act, but also business and human rights-specific frameworks, including the UN guiding principles. Moreover, in our endeavor, we found that it is implementable. So we have very theoretical frameworks, but if we drill them down to concrete use cases, they are really specific, and we can derive action guiding principles that can actually be implemented by practitioners in AI. So that being said, we will later look into the AI ethics and how to contextualize that in more detail.
there any quick clarifying questions for Alex, or save all your pressing questions to the end? Okay, great.
Great.
All right, then I invite up our next speaker, which is Katie Evans. Katie holds a doctorate in philosophy of ethics and artificial intelligence from Sorbonne University with a specialization in the ethics of autonomous vehicles. Currently, Katie works as a consultant and scientific expert for multiple actors in the AI ecosystem. She was commissioned by UNESCO in 2021 to author a comic book for AI literacy, released earlier this year in 4 languages. She is also a consultant at the IEEE for the development of ethical standards and lead an analyst at the International Research Center for Artificial Intelligence. Katie, go ahead.
Enough affiliations right now. Okay. Hello, everybody. So I'm very, very pleased to be here for such a momentous occasion to talk about this intersection between human rights and AI ethics, 2 subjects which I care very much about. I think compared to the other presentations today, mine's going to be a bit more conceptual blue sky. So just get ready for that. I hope that it'll provide maybe some like a basis for critical thinking and sort of foundational concepts for our ensuing discussion in the panel. I hope so. We'll see. But without further ado, let's take a conceptual look at AI ethics. So my presentation structure is pretty obvious. I'm going to talk about what ethics is, then I'm going to talk about what AI ethics is, and then I'm going to talk about what I call 2 types of AI ethics. It's just 2 different positions one could take about what matters morally and how that impacts the design of technology. So now that we know where we're going, just as a starter, I'd like to clarify some points about what I feel ethics is and is not. I usually make this presentation for industry, and in that sense, I feel like a lot of us maybe have a stronger background in these subjects than I'm usually used to. So sorry if I'm dumbing things down, but I still think it's important. So ethics is not a discipline that codifies wishful thinking in a given context, right? I know that a lot of times we think that ethics is just, oh, wouldn't it be great if, oh, it's so ideal. Oh, yes, if only. But that's not realistic, right? No, it is realistic. Ethics is a collection of principles, rules, or recommendations that together prevent human harm and promote human value, right? So taken sort of neutrally, and we can talk about different axiologies, different moral theories, different kinds of things like that. I don't think it's really helping our conversation today. So I'll save you all from going through all the different ethical schools and what they mean for AI ethics. That's another presentation. But the idea is just that it is a normative framework or that is internally coherent and produces something. It produces different behavior, right? So ethics is also not something subjective, personal, or cultural that we cannot all agree on. This is an argument that I hear all the time. In fact, I heard it just before we started this session. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? Because on one hand, you think, well, all of us have different values, different priorities. We come from different backgrounds, different cultures. How could we ever get along when it comes to ethics? What I like to do is make a distinction between what I call positive ethics and negative ethics, which is not me that made that up, that's just a term. Positive ethics being sort of the axiology of ethics. So where we're going with it, what are we trying to pursue? What are we trying to achieve? Negative ethics being what we don't want to have happen, right? So in one sense, it's difficult for us to align on what we want to see happen in the world, right? Because we might have different value sets. However, it's relatively easy for us to find consensus on what we do not want to have occur in the world. And I'll make the argument later that that's exactly what AI ethics is. So sometimes we can think that technology will promote human values in the way that, oh, if only we could just build an algorithm that would improve human behavior and work towards global peace. That would be a positive approach to AI ethics, which I find problematic. But a negative one is just to avoid developing harmful technology. And I think that we can all get behind. And I'll also say that, of course, ethics, and I'm sure you know this, is normative and not descriptive. So it shows the world, how it ought to be, right? Instead of how it is, which is maybe an important point to make in some circles. So obviously, it's easy for us to get along when it comes to what we want to not happen. And then finally, ethics is not an additional design burden with no grounding in hard law. because I hear that one a lot too. Why should we care about ethics? Not only is it subjective, but it's not grounded in anything. And so what I say, to be very brief, I think the true argument is more complex, is that ethics, in a sense, is a contextualization of human rights. If human rights give us sort of the foundational normative concept, then ethics is the contextualization of what matters morally in a specific action context, deployment context, whatever. So if rights are the what, ethics is the how, right? And so in that sense, they're highly compatible. And I think that's sort of the point of our meeting today, is to see exactly how that works. So excited to see that other people agree with me. Yeah, so I think we've rounded this page out. So now let's talk a bit about AI ethics specifically, right? So like I said, I see AI ethics as a type of negative ethics that aims to prevent harm via technological means, right? I explain what negative ethics is, but I think what we often overlook is, what do we mean by harm, right? In different contexts. What does it mean when we're saying we're preventing harm or harmful technology? So I'd like to offer you maybe two arguments here. The first is what I call the argument from increasing automation. This is what I consider to be the foundational argument or justification for AI ethics in tech, right? And it goes like this. If moral value is an inherent feature of an automated systems environment, then a failure to account for this moral value in the design of the automated system will result in the risk of human harm. The more autonomous this system is, the more. So the idea being, you have a deployment context, let's say in the health sector, and you know that you're going to come up against certain values in that context, like let's say personal autonomy of patients, right? If you design a system that isn't able to recognize or be sensitive to how that works in interaction, how that works in the machine's decision making, you're going to cause some harm. You're going to undermine that value, right? And then at scale, it's going to be harmful, right? So the idea is, we need to put ethics into AI as sort of an extension of the concept of safety itself, because we've started to design machines that are so autonomous, if you think about it, that they've started to expand past that center point, which is just physical harm. So when we're doing safety design, we should just care about the physical welfare of the end user. And it's starting to expand into not just the physical welfare of the end user, but also their rights and maybe some of the values they ascribe to. And then as AI becomes more prolific and more autonomous, and I use autonomous with an asterisk, but in terms of freedom from strict human oversight, then we'll also talk about prevention of harm to societies as a whole, even the democracy as a concept, even the planet, right? So we're expanding the circle of moral concern as a result of looking at ethics as an extension of safety. That's sort of my main point, right? And so human rights are starting to be threatened by the technologies that we design. And so safe design means designing for ethics and for human rights at this point, because we've seen that when that doesn't happen, it has appreciable effects on society, right? And long-lasting ones at that. So yes, that's, I think there was another little nugget that I had there, but I'll leave it alone. Okay, and so if we've understood what AI ethics is to me, then I'd like to propose maybe two ways to think about AI ethics, right? And this is a fluffy distinction, right? I think, you know, there's some details to be worked out in it, but I think it's useful when we're thinking about what matters morally in a deployment context for an AI system, especially at the design level. I call this the distinction between structural ethics and decisional ethics. This is sort of the idea of structural ethics being inputs and socio-technical focus, and then decisional ethics being very output focused, very technical focused. The NIST risk assessment framework kind of does this too. It does socio-technical risk and harm versus just technical. So you can kind of borrow that distinction if you're familiar with it. It's close, but not quite. But anyways, structural ethics is principles that ensure that the governance, functioning, and life cycle of an AI are ethically acceptable, and contrast that to decisional ethics, which is principles that ensure that the decisional output of the AI system is ethically acceptable. So I think it's pretty easy for us to recognize cases for both, right? I think a lot of what we talked about in AI ethics until recently was very structural ethics focused, right? We're going to have these design principles that are going to affect the processes of the corporation, the firm, or the entity producing the technology. And that's going to do the ethical job, right? Because at base, it's not about the AI, it's about the people behind it, because AI is just a tool. It's this whole narrative, right? But we also have technologies that make a significant case for why decisional ethics is important, independently of structural ethics. Things like ChatGPT and its interactions with society, things like autonomous vehicles and their decision-making, because they have the potential as a direct result of their decisional output to harm people. So what's important to know about these concepts first is that one does not imply the other. You can do a great job. I mean, Sam Altman can clean up his open AI structure so that it's the most privacy respecting as possible. But at this point, that won't guarantee that ChatGPT is not going to be giving advice to little girls about how to date older men or all these terrible use cases that we've seen come out. So, you know, it's not enough just to say that, oh, well, our processes are good. You also have to look at what the machine's doing. And so not only do one not flow from the other, but sometimes there's trade-offs. I think a fun example would be in autonomous vehicles, insofar as you can build a really privacy respecting machine that doesn't collect much information about the environment of the vehicle. But then when it comes time to critically assessing what matters in a context for making a decision, if you've blinded the vehicle from everything that could matter morally, you're not going to be making, perhaps, an ethically efficient decision. And how frustrating is that? Because by satisfying ethical criteria on one side, you've undermined it on the other, right? So in that sense, when you're, especially at the design level, but also when we look at standards development and the work at the IEEE, it's important to consider these two sides and the interplay between them. It's yet another trade-off that you have to mitigate in design, right? Yes, and my pitch here is only that as we gain in autonomy and complexity with, I mean, you know, GPI models being a big example of this, I think decisional ethics is going to become increasingly important. And I think this discussion we've had about, you know, alignment theory, AI alignment, is going to take on a bit of a different tone, but it's going to become much more the subject in the AI ethics debate than I think some of these structural principles were when we got this started, right? And so in that sense, that's scary because a lot of the machines that we're trying to, you know, the decisional ethics of today's machines is very, very complicated. They're super complex machines, very opaque, and, you know, it's difficult to figure out how to constrain them to act the way that we want, right? So I think that is the grand challenge for AI ethics today. And insofar as that goes, I think integrating human rights considerations into how machines treat people is sort of the be all and the end all of ethics, because at the end of the day, we're supposed to be building, you know, with AI at this level of complexity, social actors and cooperators that aren't actually harming the society they're deployed into. And that's all about decisional ethics. So with that, I think I about covered it. If anybody has any questions or wants to pick apart my concepts, I'm all ears. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. Does anyone have any kind of clarifying questions? And there's a lot to pick apart there, but
Can I
we'll
just
have-
ask one
yeah,
quick
go ahead.
question
Yeah.
about this trade-offs that you're talking about, right, between structural and decisional ethics? Can you give an example of like a
The
simple
one that I
example?
gave, that's maybe the clearest, because you have to find a technology that's making decisions on its own,
Yeah.
really, and that's still kind of only coming out, is the autonomous vehicle example, where you're privacy respecting, so the vehicle, you know, maybe only knows mass and velocity of the traffic entities, maybe the road user type, but it wouldn't know, for instance, age or gender, and you think, oh, that's great, because that's a discriminatory practice to say we're identifying the age and gender of people in the traffic environment. Except if you consider accident data that says that women are disproportionately affected by vehicle accidents because of the design structure of an autonomous vehicle, or that someone who's elderly may not have the same reaction time or recovery ability as someone who's younger, it starts to become, but if you were deciding as a human, these are the factors you might consider. But if you're deciding as someone who's trying to respect ethics structurally, you would never consider them. In fact, they're illegal. So this
Okay.
is the trade-off, right? And so I mean, in this sense, I'm not advocating that autonomous vehicles should know the gender or the age of people, goodness no. But then we have to realize that we're maybe not going to be meeting acceptability expectations in the case of vehicle accidents, because we're going to miss fundamental facts, like the difference between
Okay.
a child and a small woman, right? Which in the newspapers, that makes a difference, right? So
Okay, so by observing structural ethics, you're blinding.
in
Right,
this
the
case,
decision,
yes,
yeah, in that
because you've focused on, you've taken away the very criteria by which the machine would be able to decide ethically.
Very interesting.
Mhm. Yes. Absolutely. I think, yeah, I mean, this is something that I explored in my research and this was part of it. The problem is just that in this particular case, it might mean life or death for the person who, whose fundamental fact was missing, right? So I feel like this particular trade-off is something that you have to mitigate with the person who's deploying that particular AV, because it's, I don't think there's like a one size fits all solution. I mean, I can make general recommendations. For instance, I can say, I don't want physical criteria that I could pick up with object classification to be used in any other way but the quantification of expected harm in a decision case. I don't want it to be used, for instance, to pick out the darlings of society by some acceptability study. So I'm not going to pick off the less popular and save the more popular. That's a bad way to use any kind of, personal characteristic, obviously. So you can, if you're consulting with the car manufacturer, for instance, you can say, these are the bright lines that you should respect across this trade-off. And then let's talk about how we should do that on top of compliance, obviously. And then, safety regulation, which is nice and fun too. So, yes.
Great. Oh, one more.
Well,
Go ahead.
last question.
Mm.
For me, coming from industry, your presentation was really insightful. I would like to ask about harm.
Yeah.
As far as I understood it, with respect to autonomy, it means that if we still keep the key role for the human, then the harm is not that high, is less, or is that the wrong statement?
No, I mean, that is the relationship that I set up in my concept. I would say this, let's say that there's like, so many moral facts that we should know about a decision context. And there's two actors that can handle them, a human and a machine, right? So on either side, someone has to be doing some moral weightlifting to decide what should happen here from a moral perspective, taking into consideration the facts of the case. If it's the human making that decision, then we fall back into a sort of traditional approach to ethics, where it's a reasoned, justifiable solution that a human's come up with for a specific use case. But if it's an AI, then you have to be able to automate those considerations in a way that they still crop up in the way that you like, right? So that's what I mean. It's just that as the machines are the complexity of the decision-making comprehends ethical decision-making, maybe not explicitly, but tacitly because of their context, then yes, harm is increased because it's just that much more of a design challenge, frankly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great. We'll have more time to discuss this in a few minutes. So thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Jenny Lee. She's a senior manager at EY, Wirtschaftsprüfungsgesellschaft, where she specializes in data privacy risk and compliance. She advises clients on privacy risk management, AI and privacy governance frameworks and operating models, and regulatory compliance. Jenny is a frequent speaker at the International Association of Privacy Professionals and author of several publications on topics such as differential privacy, third-party risk, privacy risk management, and data loss prevention. Jenny, welcome.
Well, thank you for including us in the conversation today. This really important conversation, and for the invitation to speak about this topic from a more corporate perspective. I had never thought about decisional ethics before, and I think this just at least emphasizes for me the complexity of this entire space, right? Especially as we, as a consulting firm, are out there advising our clients on how to really tackle these challenges. And I have some good news, which is that we have supported now 2 large global pharmaceutical companies who are not laying people off or taking this topic for granted. Instead, they're really creating departments and hiring more staff to manage this really difficult topic, right? A lot of them are calling this technology ethics because, and this is the whole topic of responsible innovation. So all companies, especially pharma companies, are digitizing. And so they want to put an emphasis to do that properly, to respect human rights, respect their patients' rights throughout the concepts that they're developing. So, of course, AI holds tremendous promise for corporate growth and opportunity. And this idea of responsible innovation is really about developing and deploying all digital and AI technologies in a way that respects human rights and also safeguards data privacy. So that intersection, I've heard it come up a lot now with privacy, but of course, in the news, we hear a lot about, especially with ChatGPT, right, the privacy implications of these types of technologies. So it's really about the balancing of these benefits to corporations and then, of course, the risks that come with these efforts. And which, of course, isn't completely new, right? The whole idea of privacy is widely recognized as a fundamental human right, as codified in, so Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Center of Charter of Fundamental Rights, et cetera. So this kind of attachment to human rights and fundamental rights is has always been part of the privacy conversation. To start with this myth and truth. So the common myth in a lot of organizations is that responsible innovation is just one of the considerations for developing data-driven technologies, whereas the truth is it's actually at the core, right? At the core to business and success of data-driven technologies. And this is the way that I think successful organizations or companies who will be successful at these tasks will have to see it, not just one of the aspects, but at the core of it. And there are a lot of external dynamics that are supporting these conversations. Some of it before you, what's jumping out at you is this 4.04 billion euro cumulative GDPR fine since 2018. So a lot of our consulting practices are also on the side of this privacy compliance. And now we're seeing that conversation shift more and more toward technology ethics because of these growing fines, according to the regulation. More than 71% of global of countries now across the world have privacy laws, and this is just increasing probably at a day-to-day basis now. 40% of people have been reported to have stopped doing business with companies that were not protective of their customer data. 92% of patients, so we do quite a lot of these engagements with pharmaceutical companies, 92% of patients believe privacy is their right, and their right to health data their health data should not be available for purchase. And this 1.8 to 1, so a 0.8 factor of return on investment for data privacy. So from a very corporate perspective, does this pay off in the long run? And it absolutely does, right, to pay attention to this. And of course, this 800 plus, though there are currently 800 plus AI related policies across 89 countries and regions globally. And this is also growing as companies are doing more work in this space and the regulations are coming. So the rest of this discussion is more about almost from a use case perspective, what we are currently doing for the companies that we're supporting. And so this is the situation they're currently in, some of the challenges they're facing, and also what it is that they need. And this is coming from a perspective of we're talking a lot about AI models. We're talking a lot about biases within those models, but how do you really control that from a corporate perspective? I mean, before you get to the model element, what does that structure look like in the organization to manage this risk properly? And this is really where I think a lot of organizations who may have had privacy programs in place in the last couple of years are just now turning around and saying, oh, we've got to do something about tech ethics, also from a governance perspective. And so the situation that they're in is, of course, the societal expectation for privacy and data protection, this whole idea of trustworthy AI and digital technology development and use, and the overall ethical business conduct, especially in the life sciences area. They also have organizational values, cultural and ethical commitments, that need to be embedded in the way that digital and AI risk is managed in these innovative business areas. Of course, considering the heavily evolving regulatory landscape. And the trend is toward these risk-based approaches, right, to regulate the innovative technologies. The challenge is, of course, defining what that overall governance and operating model really should look like, right? What does that look like in an organization so they can properly have an oversight over technology ethics and privacy? And then the other challenge is global corporations have this, stuff that happens at the global scale and things that happen at the local levels. And there's this fragmentation at the local levels. And this combination of global enterprise oversight and local operationalizing is a really big struggle for most large companies. And of course, they're also dealing with existing and known gaps. So if you have a privacy program already in place, likely if you have an establishment in the EU, then since 2018, hopefully, then you already have some gaps identified. You may have gone through an internal audit or have an enterprise risk assessment already. What do you do about existing gaps on a more mature program like privacy? And how do you align that with newer risk programs like AI and digital ethics? So what we've been tasked with often is to provide organizations with a holistic understanding of what are their legal and regulatory requirements across these different risks. So digital, AI, privacy, in the context of life science, also bioethics. So how do we bring all those risks together and kind of combine all those related risks to come up with a governance and operating model for the organization? And that includes evaluation. So of course, of their existing governance and operating models, what do you currently have in place? And this could impact, are you doing your privacy impact assessments properly? Are you doing that for all your digital assets? Do you know all your digital assets? Most corporations won't know this, right? They don't have a data inventory or a digital asset inventory, and you can't control what you don't know. And so this is really a big need and risk area. And then the assessment of current design of practices and processes. So the PIA I mentioned before, are you doing privacy by design, for example, which of course is, this is what you need when you're doing innovative technologies. And then you need a forward-looking roadmap. So what are you going to do in the next 1 to 3 years? As these regulations come and your digitization process continues, how do you keep compliant? And what kind of structure will you have in place in the organization to support that compliance? And then, of course, you need some independent risk mitigation recommendations for your existing risks. So how do you close those gaps of things you're already doing, change how you're governing it, and create new processes for future management? So it's a pretty big endeavor, and this is really what some of these large pharmaceutical companies are currently engaging to do. And of course, this is good. This might be relatively self-explanatory. So businesses who are responsible for innovation can create positive impacts for customers, those that comply with regulations, those that meet societal expectations, make responsible decisions. This leads to people who are receptive to that innovation. And those people are their employees, their customers, the regulators, society, academia. So people will be receptive to that, and that will allow the business to continue to innovate, right? So that also fosters trust and drives value. Value being in improvement in reputation, trust with their customers, employee pride, and maybe some financial gain, right? Also. So if companies want to digitize, if they rely on customers, trust and reputation to make decisions, if they want to say they stand for integrity, fairness, and honesty, then they really need a responsible innovation program that is enabling, that is people-centered, and that is efficient and effective. So how do we really support some of these organizations to do that? We support them by doing these assessments on their overall governance and operating model framework. We use a standard risk assessment method. So we go through all of look into their risk ecosystem, look into their people and culture, see if they're doing risk taxonomies across digital risk, privacy risk, et cetera. How do they manage that? What kind of technologies and tools are they using? So now we're not talking about the digital tools, but the tools that they're using to actually manage that risk, what kind of at the enterprise level and also at the local levels. And some of the frameworks we use, at least for AI, is the trusted AI framework and the data privacy and data trust model. which goes to the data privacy and trust model goes through 15 different domains for privacy compliance or privacy activities, also through the operations of those privacy activities, the governance over the privacy activities, and how they use personal information. And then the trusted AI framework goes through the life cycle, data's life cycle through an AI process at every aspect of that life cycle, whether unbiased decisions are being made, whether it's a resilient model, whether it's explainable, transparent, etc. The standards you see, it's like an endless list of standards. These are just some of the sample standards that cover some of the typical AI standards, also some maybe some familiar data privacy standards and frameworks that underline these frameworks and models that we use. So a sampling of outcomes, at least for the engagements that we have had, is this legal and regulatory landscape overview. And so this is not just in the context of AI regulations or data privacy regulations, but for life science, also industry regulations. So clinical trials regulations, et cetera, right? So outside the realm of just what is overarching for privacy and AI. And this is applicable across various global geographies. And so for these global companies, we've done this for US, EU, Japan, China, lots of different geographies with different regulations. So the companies actually know what they're impacted by and what their responsibilities are at a high level. And then we've done the governance and operating model assessment based on the frameworks and models that I just described. And here we've identified gaps and areas for improvement. So prioritize by criticality across all of the different domains. And this is an assessment into whether they have the proper vertical and horizontal integration within their organization between their business units. And these kinds of assessments, whether there's proper communication, whether there's proper translation of frameworks into operating procedures. This is probably the most difficult part. But that all goes into the governance and operating model assessment. And we also do a compliance risk management capabilities assessment. So are they set up for success? Do you have the proper capabilities to run your compliance processes and procedures? And also then identify gaps and areas of improvement, also prioritized by criticality across the different risk management dimensions. And then this recommendations roadmap. So how can organizations enhance their governance and operating model into the future? How can they create and ensure compliance risk managing capabilities in terms of short and long-term actions to achieve the level of maturity that they want? These are sampling of deliverables. Ultimately, to achieve responsible innovation, companies need to be able to translate regulatory requirements and ethical considerations in a way that those frameworks are useful tools for the organization, because everything in theory sounds really good, but in practice is really difficult to execute, right? How do I take all those laws and regs and how do I actually implement those into my organization so that I actually get a product in the end that's compliant? Not such an easy task. And also to build solutions to support that implementation. So a solution is great, but it has to be able to be rolled out. People have to understand it, know when to use it. And these are also really difficult things to achieve. And of course, privacy by design, ethics by design. It's been 5 years since GDPR. Very few companies have really done proper privacy by design. I think if you are an organization that really does that well, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to ethics by design, right? But you have to get that, the beginnings of that set up properly, and this is very difficult. So design program requirements and establish enterprise level systems so that you know what risks you're managing at the enterprise level and what risks you're managing at the local levels. So hope that gives you some insight into some of the things that we do and how we look at this issue from a corporate perspective. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Are there any immediate questions for Jenny in her presentation? I'm sure we have many points to talk on later, though.
By also working on compliance tools, which can be used by development teams as well as sanctions like privacy and compliance, everything in the fairness area, transparency. So fairness is of course also a question of detection of bias, which is more a technical question, I would say.
Yeah.
On top to incorporate anti-discrimination law and so forth. So this is more a question which should be checked at the very legal or compliance functions.
Yeah. Tools to assess whether fairness decisions are coming. I think we've done a lot. So we've done a lot of assessments on whether this is the fairness decision is coming out this way, right? And we can assess whether that is happening, and then can of course support you in tools that can effectuate that goal. Is this what you mean, or I don't think I'm understanding? Yeah.
Sustainable AI and fairness and AI and support, and of course, the first one is some checks if there is a bias in the data or not, and metrics for that. And of course, the compliance function, the privacy function, able to oversee this. And then here also some legal questions on the topic of the bias and
Yeah.
The second layer of the check needs to be done. EY is working on kind of comprehensive tools that to help the business as well as the compliance.
So I don't know if you mean tools by technology, or do you mean like a structure? Because okay, you're talking about tools, whether to do that. Wow, I don't, maybe, but I would have to look into this, I think. Yeah, I'm happy to look into that. Off the top of my head, I can't think of a tool that we've developed ourselves to support this, but happy to check around if we do. Or surely, so we always say we're tool agnostic, and meaning that we will pick whatever works properly or best for your organization, size, industry, etc. But can definitely speak with you about that further. Sure.
Great. Any other questions for the panel? Okay, great. Thank you, Jen, so much.
Thanks.
Finally, we have one more speaker. I invite up Mario Tokarz, is a seasoned leader in AI and digital transformation with over a decade of experience at teams and companies. His work includes leading the creation of BMW Group's Data Center for Autonomous Driving and contributing to the development of an urban autonomous driving software stack at AID Argo AI. These experiences honed his perspective on balancing compliance and ethics with innovation in AI applications. Mario is deeply invested in AI ethics, serving currently as the authorized assessor of IEEE's Certified AI Ed program. Mario, welcome to the stage.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk a bit about engineering and ethics and human rights. It's a bit funny to me, so I brought this slide so just you know what I've been working on in the past, because I think it's kind of maybe important to understand where I'm coming from, because this is, I think, the first time that it's not like technical people that I know asking me about what I think about ethics now that I work with it, but the other way around, that people who work with ethics and human rights actually ask me to come over and talk about what I think about engineering. So it's a first timer for me. So I only started this endeavor to look into AI and ethics about 2 years ago. And what I've been doing before, I think, is a bit summarized in those pictures, right? So I started as an engineer. And for example, here you see work at BMW, where I did the prototypes, which was the first touchscreen that BMW had in the car. And I was actually doing the prototype as a programmer, right? And then I moved over into a new side of BMW, which is represented here in the middle, where we did stuff like, for example, HMI systems, and I was the senior manager for that one. Or we talked about the introduction of software update in the car. And back then, those who remember will know that everybody was crazy about Tesla doing these software updates. And no German car company could do that. And the reason was that basically there were very different optimization goals, right? Tesla had this big thing, 150K type of car, and German car manufacturers are trying to build everything from, I don't know, 25K up to very high numbers, but we solved very different engineering challenges. And that's why we looked into that type of problem, which is really a state management problem in the end. And we did this at a site where I started when it had 60 people. And 3 years later, I left to Munich and it had 250 people. So it was a massive scale up there. And then I went into autonomous driving at BMW, and we started at 0, or actually 2 people. And we scaled that program up to 100 people in a bit over 2 years. And that was also where BMW built their own data center, actually, to support that operation, because back then, well, people were not really believing in cloud maybe to the extent that was needed at that point. So anyways, and then I went over into AID, where I now today learned that I also worked with Caitlin's husband without knowing that actually. And we started with 70 people when I was there, and it actually scaled up to 350 over 2 years. And then eventually got acquired by Argo, and the rest is a bit history at this point. But this is the last project I was actually responsible for at that side. And then when I went out of this, and you can read up a bit on the Argo AID transition, which was a big merger, and it really was a bit of a tough time for me to see, like, you know, if technology is such a fast-moving environment, and there was a merger, and a lot of people got laid off for reasons that I didn't understand at the time, and I even find hard to conceive today. And so I was looking actually for how could the stuff that I worked on in the past be meaningful for the future. And one thing I did in the past, which is this year, is talking about open source software at BMW. And that was super interesting because open source software, if you know it, comes with these licenses, and you have all these requirements, like, for example, include the source code, include the license text, certain disclaimers and so on that need to be attached. And I learned that it's super difficult to have an techno-social system, which a company eventually is, right? So it is people that do a lot of complicated things every day, all academics, or maybe a mixture of academics and very skilled workers, right? And they do this 8 hours a day over years. And in the end, when everything pops out, you want there to be 150 different license tags, and they better be correct, because otherwise you're going to be sued. And that's what engineers and organizations did. And I thought, well, that sounds like a challenge that we're going to see again. And here we are. So I'm not going to repeat on this part, because I think my colleagues here have talked about this. I think one thing about AI is that you can find these two extremes of the discussion, right? So the first slide was like, AI basically helps a disabled person to walk again. And the other one is, this was kind of debunked a bit, but I still thought it's a good example of what we read in the media basically every day, where somebody working at the US Air Force said that they ran a simulation, and in that simulation, the best way out for the AI was to take the human operator out so that it could score more points that it got for actually eliminating targets. And later on, he said that he misspoke, so you can read that up. But I think I didn't take it out because I think it shows very much what we're looking at in the media every day, right? It's always like, AI is going to save the world. AI is going to kill us all. So this is basically a bit of what we see these days. And I think that's kind of super dangerous, because we tend to talk about stuff that in the end, maybe both of these aspects are just unrealistic, right? If we really believe that AI would kind of eliminate society tomorrow, we probably act differently. So we all take it with a grain of salt at the moment. And at the same time, we also know that it's probably not going to solve every problem we have. But we also know that it's like technology as such is an extremely useful tool. For example, just imagine COVID, and we wouldn't have had Microsoft Teams or whatever, or Zoom, right? Zoom wasn't even known before COVID. Nobody knew what Zoom was. And all of a sudden, they were one of the biggest companies, obviously, in the world. And if we hadn't had that, our whole society would have maybe just collapsed, right? So arguably, technology has advantages, and the advantages are somewhere in there, in that messy middle. And so I didn't actually know what to talk about exactly. So I just brought you some theories that I built over the last 2 years, and just so you know how I came to think about these topics around tech ethics, and happy to discuss them afterwards. So as a pre-word, I work a lot with IEEE and also with Cyber Speakerman, and there's this wonderful standard IEEE 7000, which already addresses some of the questions you might have about how to build in ethics. And I think these are super useful tools, and I'll mention them a bit moving forward. So the first part, maybe trying to keep the time more or less, but I think it's extremely hard in this space we're in to talk about what really matters. And the easiest example is the trolley problem, right? So this is most of you might have heard of this, right? I think when I was at BMW, there was no event you could have where people wouldn't ask you about it, because it's this dilemma situation where the train is rolling towards 5 people, and then you've got this guy here, which could be an AI in the future, right? And that person needs to decide, am I pulling the lever, yes or no? And by doing that, you can ask like, wow, should you sacrifice one person that is better than sacrificing 5 people, right? if that person was elderly, what would you do then? And then it comes into the question, like, do you think from a result perspective, or do you think that some stuff just shouldn't be done? Like, I should never do something that harms a person and so on. It brings up all these interesting questions, which are totally irrelevant to the discussion we have, because you can prove me wrong, but there's no proof that ever such a situation has ever occurred at any point in time. So why would you think that this is really what makes the autonomous vehicle viable or not? It's really not. The question is more like, what does the car maybe do when there's a pedestrian and somebody who's on the sidewalk, right? Does it recognize people of all skin colors with the same degree? These are questions. And we basically deal with these like on a rolling basis, like every day in companies, people just make those decisions, right? So this was from the UK, where they had a government site accepting passport pictures that would not recognize people of color, which you know, it's fine. You can just go to the office, but if you're a person of color and then you always have to go to the office because the site just doesn't work for you, that is a really impact on your life, right? Or in Italy, there was a system which would penalize people for not showing up to their shift for Deliveroo, I think, regardless of what the reason was, right? So your child could be at home sick and you just get shitty shifts afterwards, right? Or this one I also find funny. This is pretty current, like chatbots hallucinating, right? We all find it super useful. It might just give us total crap. And these are things which could really have impact on concrete people and now. And it's not such a bogus type of thing where in the future, at some point, something could maybe happen that is as extreme as the example with the trolley problem, right? And so I think this is really important. And I learned this in the last few years. This is from the IEEE standard. This context of use is really important. So what are we really talking about? We're not talking about every vehicle that was ever built or that could be imagined. We really need to go down and be very, very concrete what the application is we're talking about. Take autonomous trains, for example. There's an autonomous underground in Nuremberg, which has been operating since, I think, 2008. And it has some issues also, but it's an autonomous system that has been existing for 15 years, right? So you need to be really concrete what you talk about. Is one learning that I wanted to share. And the next thing is, I think that in some of the discussions, common sense is somehow missing. I'm going to elaborate a bit on that. But I think looking into technical ethics actually leads you to very tough quality questions. It's quality. It's not a really new thing, because in the end, when you know what the system should do, you need to make sure that it actually does that. So it doesn't mean that it's not a tough question to decide what a system should do or not, but the tough question is, how do you make sure it actually does that? And this is a nice thing. I'm going to talk a bit more about quality afterwards, but this is a nice thing about this value-based engineering approach, which actually shows you that if you have something like privacy and you have something like a requirement around what a system should be doing, which they call ethical value requirement, you really need to get into this risk management approach, and you should say, what can go actually wrong and how can I mitigate that? And I think we heard it also in previous presentations. I think we shouldn't see that as a totally new type of issue. We should just say, well, this is actually a really tough quality issue. If I told you there's a new TV set and 99% of people will actually be super happy with it and have the best time of their life, just 1% of people it will knock them out because they get a seizure. Would you sell that? No, you would not, right? And the same thing is actually, I think, lost in this conversation sometimes, that when we look at this new technology, we seem to have lost this idea of how much does it actually add value and what are the risks. And normally the threshold of not bringing a product, if there is a risk to people, is very low. So in most areas where there is the low risk of harming anyone, we would rather not do it. And in the technology space, I think somehow this has shifted. And I asked ChatGPT, just as a joke, I think it's always funny to bring those in, right? So what would you actually trust the quality of an AI system given the rapid development on the technology? Short answer, please, because otherwise it will give you all these like depends type of things. But what it says is that the technology can be valuable, but it's important to use them with caution and awareness of their limitations. Not hallucinated, that's actually true. And so if you look at quality as such, it's actually a question that is as old as engineering maybe is, right? So we're not really, my theory is we're not really facing a new kind of challenge, but we're facing a challenge with a new type of technology. But the challenge itself is pretty old. And just to say how old it is, So there's even books from the Romans which have been brought to the present about architecture. And I thought this was a cool quote. The ideal building has three elements. It's sturdy, it's useful, and it's beautiful. And I'm not sure if that applies to AI. You could have a nice discussion over beer, like what the adjectives would be here. But certainly the sturdiness is not something that seems to be on the top of people's mind at the moment, right? And I thought that was quite insightful. Also, and that's actually one of the main things that I would like to point out. Quality, if you see it as a quality problem and you talk to people, how do you build a quality product? They will tell you, well, there's all sorts of stuff you need. You need a good risk management system, top down probably, but it also has a very, very strong bottom up element to it, right? And just to show you that, this is a picture from Toyota, and you can read into their method of doing quality. And for example, they've got this stop the line type of approach, right? So this is what you see here. That's the line in the production. And if there's one single car on the line, and somebody thinks, well, this is not high quality, they will pull the rope and the whole thing will stop, right? And I think that's a great picture of thinking about like what needs to happen in companies. So the whole idea is that this individual actually feels that they are empowered to do that, right? Because people tell them, well, if you get one car wrong, it's going to be such a hassle. You know, for example, people use screws in cars, if you know that, right? If you screw something and the screw drops in, and then you kind of build the car, you can never deconstruct it again and fix it. And that's why they tell those people, hey, you are empowered to stop the whole line so that we can fix that one issue. And I think in companies that idea of ethics is still missing. It's so important, but I don't think we have transported this idea enough to give people that empowerment, right? You need structure, you need risk management, but you also need that engineering culture where people would see themselves empowered. Don't read the details of this. It's in a blog post I had on LinkedIn about the IEAI Act, and you will see that they have all these methods, right? Like you need to test, you need testing for your requirements, you need data quality, and so on. These are all checklists, but in the end, you have these real people working in the line in companies, and they really need to understand what the essence of this is, and they need to feel empowered to say, hey, I'm not going to ship that product because I don't feel this is transparent enough, right? It's not meeting the threshold. And this is something that I feel companies need to develop. And well, I just thought that I would be running out of time, which I probably am. So I just said the humans to the front seat, please. Because I think one big issue from my observation in the last few years is also that I think we tend in the communication around this, we tend to assume like a passive type of role as humans, right? So people are like, there will not be jobs anymore. Your job is going to be away, right? So it's always these predictions about the future. There's also Harari, the author, if you know him, he's got a lot of these videos. And it's super interesting because he has this great narration type of style, but he always presents stuff as if it was already the truth, right? Says, well, this is going to happen. But I don't think that's actually necessarily the case. I think that we as a society need to define what we want to happen, right? And I think there's also a lot of stakes somehow, so it's in it. But it's also important to not see ourselves as only the standby people, but as people who can actually also take our fate in our own hands, right? And I talked to my former boss, who I really like, just 2 weeks ago, and I said, yeah, I think we shouldn't let ourselves be degraded into that passive role. And he said, well, in the end, what's going to be invented is going to be invented, right? But I said, yeah, maybe that's true. However, we don't need to make it even easier, right? So, for example, the EU is just now talking about abolishing cash or having a digital euro. And I'm like, well, if you're afraid that IT is going to take over everything, why would you do that, right? I mean, that's not a necessity, that's actually a choice. And if you want to look a bit more into that, I can recommend this talk, which I found really inspiring, from Timnit Gebru, who left Google in this very infamous type of role where it was about speech models. And I thought that was very interesting because she talks a bit about this kind of screwed up, in my opinion, screwed up, let's say, human model that people have been created, where humans are maybe a bit put in the position of being the system failure, right? So technology makes everything better, just the human is kind of the problem, and we're going to overcome that by using technology. And I think what I learned, or what I came to believe, is that I strongly propose that type of view. So summing it up a bit, back to the title, I think that from a corporate engineering perspective, we just need to see that aligning systems with values will be just an indispensable part of engineering moving forward. And we need to see that as our task as point two, to create these structural prerequisites and designing systems that respect ethical values. And this is very practical, right? So you need a process, but you also need to train people and you need to give them the tools that they need. And you also need to accept that it costs money, and you also need to accept that people will speak up and so on. And this is work that needs to be happening within companies. And that's basically the summary of that, right? So we need to build this culture of, I call it sometimes ethical quality, in the sense of seeing that as yet another aspect that our systems need to observe. And with that, thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Are there any quick clarification questions from Mario before I invite everyone up? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Yes, you said, okay, it's basically a quality issue to get the systems do what they should do. I agree in some sense. What I see is with the new technologies, and I would not just focus on AI, but in general, new technologies, we get into new application areas. And we get more autonomous action. We take over decisions that humans have taken. And with that, I see that we have to consider new quality criteria. So far, maybe fairness, discrimination was not a quality criteria for technical systems because there were no applications that had an impact on that. But with these new developments, all these fundamental rights issues are coming into the quality criteria. And this is a new thing for the companies, also for the people. They are not used to this kind of quality criteria. And the other thing is, it's also the increasing complexity that it makes it more difficult to consider all the issues that you have to take into account and that you have to somehow solve.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So why I made this picture of this being basically a quality thing there's two aspects to it, I think, or two examples. So of course, this is new. And if you look into it, you will see that for a lot of those things, there are just no solutions yet, right? However, why I said it's basically about quality is that if you take any other product and you would ask, like, when would I actually sell that, or what should be the threshold be, how safe it is, or how much I know about it myself, I think if you applied those criteria to these new technologies, you would often maybe not really sell it. One example, I looked this up before because I thought of it. Everybody has weird quirks, and I had one that when I had a cold, I always used this one like cough spray. And when I got a cold, I was always like going to the pharmacy, and I was like, I want that particular cough spray, give it to me. And then one day I came there and she was like, no, it's not on the market anymore. They pulled it. And I was like, why would they pull my cough spray, right? So why would they do that? And the reason was that in very, very rare cases, it would cause allergic reactions in some people. And those were pretty severe. And so they said, well, it's just a cough. Why would I have a thing which only if it's like 1 in 1,000 or less, or maybe in 10,000, why would I have a cough spray that causes some people to almost die when all it does is treat like a simple cold where the other people can just, you know, drink tea and stay home. And I think that's the thing here, that somehow this proportion, I think, is a bit off in the tech stuff, right? So it makes some people depressive, but, you know, well, most people have fun and they find it nice to look like at commercials. And that's why I say, if we treat it like a quality problem, I think we should also apply our sense of what's good enough to actually be shipped. That's why I said that maybe it's good to reduce the problem to something we already know, because we've been looking into that for quite a long time. I think that was my argument, a bit rephrased. But I agree to what you said. It's a super difficult problem, obviously, right? So, yeah.
And also the question, what is good enough, when it is safe enough? I think for autonomous cars, you still have not an answer for it.
Yeah, that's true.
Have another question? If not, we don't have that much time, but I invite you all up for a few questions.
Just grab this one.
Yeah, you step next to Alex, so you can share the mic.
Good.
So we don't have that much time and I won't take us too much over. And also we invite you all afterwards to stay and have some coffee and cookies and drinks and ask more questions to our panelists. I think we heard like a lot of very different perspectives here today. And I wanted to start with kind of just an overarching question. And then I'll open it up for more questions as well. So we talked a lot today about AI ethics, but we're all here today to talk about human rights and AI as well. And I was wondering, is the talk now moving this move towards human and fundamental rights? And I'd love to hear it from, the ethics experts' perspective, from the engineering perspective, from the corporate perspective, all these things. Is it a natural progression that we're moving from ethics to talking more about rights, or are they in conflict? How do you guys see kind of these two conversations going on? Or is there no need for a distinction at some level? Like maybe Alex, or
Okay. I think this is a very important question because first, I would say that we have different ethical traditions. So when it comes to utilitarianism, for example, when it comes to deontology, we tend to emphasize different things. And even this applies to settings between human rights. So there are different ways to interpret human rights, basically two, I would say, underlying frameworks. One is the idea of human rights as freedoms. So in a way, freedom of pain, in a way, you could say that you have the idea of bodily integrity or mental integrity being identified as a constitutional right. This means that no one can harm you, such as a state or a police officer or someone else, someone having power, essentially. So we speak about defense rights in a way. So it is restraining the use of power by others, such as an enterprise, but also a state. At the same time, we have the dimension of human rights understood as claim rights, which means that we have the right to go to a school. This implies that the state sets up an infrastructure for that and also gives us some kind of access to it. And of course, sometimes we have conflicts. So on the one side, we have freedom of occupation, but on the other side, we also have the idea of, for example, realizing diversity and so on and so forth. So there are many conflicts actually within different aspects of human rights, which are not really settled. And I think also here ethics comes in. So the idea of basically reconciling trade-offs between human rights. And I believe in this way, it's a very complicated interplay between ethical norms that are used for the interpretation of human rights, but also in many situations, human rights being used as an interpretation of ethical frameworks. For example, when it comes to bioethics. So here it's quite clear that we have bioethical standards. We inform them by human rights to get a better understanding of that. However, when it comes to trade-off within ethics, or within human rights, sometimes we rely on ethics, as we did, for example, in the COVID-19 situation. We used ethics as a way to understand human rights. So this relationship is quite complex also in the context of AI. And I guess that the human rights challenge of artificial intelligence indeed is that by programming and also in a way selecting many choices when doing a model, we in a way try to settle many conflicts within human rights in advance, because we need to identify that before we build a model. And I think this is the true challenge, because in a way, we need to become constitutional courts in a way, settling trade-offs between human rights when doing that. And I see this as the major challenge for the fundamental rights impact assessment, actually.
Jenny, moving over to, staying on this topic, but I was looking at the long list of different frameworks and rules and laws that you look at when you're thinking about risk assessment and technology risk assessment. And I didn't see any of those type of things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or the UN Global Compact. Does it make sense to integrate some of these even though they're not tech focused, into these assessments? Or do you feel they're covered in other ways, or that they're incompatible in some way?
No, I think that's actually what came to mind when Alex was speaking, right? Is this intersection where this would be a really good place to kind of bring those concepts in. I think that, we don't have a human rights or fundamental rights assessment. This is exactly what it is that you're working on. And so, from a corporate perspective, it's what's available out there for us to use. And I think it would be I don't know if it would be welcome, because you can see how long this list already is, and one of the challenges is which of those standards do we want to use, like in terms of, from a corporate perspective, right? Not every corporation uses the same standards. Sometimes there's considerations of we should align one standard with an existing standard that the organization's already using, so that it's an easier risk assessment. And this happens with NIST all the time, right? The cybersecurity NIST framework is often used by your cyber colleagues. And so from the privacy perspective, it's, okay, we have ISO standards, we have NIST standards, we have all kinds of standards. Which one do we want to use that practically would support the organization in moving forward with these assessments? I think if you had these other types of frameworks, I think if they can be mapped well to what's already understood well by organizations, I think would be also very useful.
Katie, do you have any thoughts on kind of integrating these two agendas?
Which two agendas?
I mean, like the human rights and the ethics.
Oh,
and
yeah. Well, I mean, I made my simple point about, about the what of human rights and the how of ethics in context. I think that still holds. And I really liked Alex's incommensurability point, because I find we're 2 points. The first, maybe, I feel like we're at a juncture now in AI ethics where, as Alex said, we're kind of moving away from having responsible AI teams in GAFM and, loving that life. And so I feel like, but the risks and the results are still very real. And so I feel like the inclusion of fundamental rights and human rights is a timely thing, because it's kind of, drawing force from these legal conceptions into ethics, which has always been considered to be a little bit more floaty and kind of recommendy instead of hard law. So I feel like we're kind of calling in for backup as ethicists, and this is what it looks like. And does that mean that we're instrumentalizing human rights? I mean, does that even make sense to say if we're all on the same side? But I feel like there's a little bit of a switcheroo, just so that we can still kind of hold people to account, especially with what's been coming out in the past year or so. So yeah, there's that.
Great. And then I promise I'll open it up for questions, and then to bring Maria's perspective in, does this have some sort of tangible application in terms of kind of the engineer's decision-making process, or is it too?
So I didn't explicitly say that, but normally engineers are trained to avoid fuzzy topics somehow. So if it's a legal topic, ask a lawyer. And that's why I think also a lot of people are just, and I don't think they mean badly, but they are just very uncomfortable with that, right? So, and they maybe don't realize that they make these decisions anyway. So they're not innocent in that sense. So I think it does have a dimension for engineers, and we need to talk about, for example, how companies could get actual support for people who do engineering work in getting guidance on tough questions, because I mean, it's also not nice for a compliance lawyer to answer these questions. So sometimes a lawyer will tell you, I would rather not say anything on that, but that's also not the solution. So I think this is a very real question, like how would people get access to resources and people with experience to actually guide the engineering. So I think it's interesting in that respect. And one thing I could offer from a discussion I had was also that maybe human rights are also a way of governments to confer about these type of topics. And my take on that was also that maybe seeing human rights becoming more important means that hopefully there's a more also broader discussion in the political space. I can't verify that, but it was a discussion I had with somebody working with NATO also. And that person told me that she saw that as a way for countries to compromise. In that sense, I think it could hopefully be helpful to get more guidance on what to do in engineering. Yeah.
Great. I mean, I have opened up for other questions. I'm going to walk around so we can hear on the recording too.
Thank you very much. Are we seeing a convergence between law, ethics, and morality in the discussion of when we discuss AI and technology in general?
Anyone want to jump in?
Take it, Alex.
I think it's a real complex topic. It depends on the definition you're using. So morality in a way is understood as in a way, the sum of traditions that are prevailing in the society. Ethics in a way as the normative debate, philosophically driven on with abstract criteria on certain issues, and human rights in a way reflecting also both elements in a way that we have this idea of philosophy of human rights built upon autonomy of individuals, freedom and equal treatment. And I guess, of course, many things are very much context dependent here, because, for example, in certain cultures, certain behavior can be regarded as insulting someone, for example. So that means that a person is hurt, which then somehow translates into human rights implications. I guess also the work we have been doing also with Oksana here on mental health, for example, is a very important dimension, because this has a lot of cultural perspective in it. But also, like, when we look at what we are doing in business ethics, we see that morality and also the way how we interpret norms is really a major key for understanding human rights implications in finance, for example, and those kind of things. So I think this is a very interesting interplay, but we need also to accept certain traditions as a given, because they determine the impact actions have and leave on human beings.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just follow up with that. Oh, I have my little thing. I completely agree with Alex. I would also say, though, that if we're playing so much with morality, ethics, and the law right now, I think it's because technology is really pushing the boundaries of the rights that we have already. I think that technology enables choices, whether they be technical choices or human choices, that didn't exist before. And with that, fundamental concepts like freedom of expression, autonomy, shift, right? You know, if we can be inside someone's brain and maybe not read their thoughts, but could influence their behavior through brain-computer interfaces, what does that do to privacy, or, you know, the sanctity of your body, all these concepts that used to be pretty cut and dry since they existed. So I think we're kind of figuring out what the stakes are even are in the human rights landscape too. I mean, for instance, the IEEE has a lot of work they're doing right now with the Council of Europe on the potential to expand and modify fundamental rights in the context of the metaverse, because we are reinventing society, so to speak. There's no need for scarcity as a concept on the metaverse. It would be a design choice, right? And a corporate one at that. So with that, how does this landscape that we're so used to and that we cherish so much change, right? And I think it changes in big ways. So maybe that's also why we're pulling from morality and ethics and law all at once, just trying to grasp at straws.
Thanks so much. All right, we have time for just a couple more questions.
Thank you. When you talk about AI ethics, would you focus more on affected individuals or on society as a whole? There can be trade-offs. If you think, for example, on creditworthiness assessment, there can be good reasons from an actuarial perspective, for example, to say, okay, it's too risky, to provide a loan to a particular individual, but on a society level, you tend to discriminate certain part of society. So how do you deal with that trade-off?
And maybe just to add, this is one of my thoughts too, that the human rights perspective and much of our ethical perspectives are very individual focused as well. I think it adds on to this topic, and it's one I wanted to bring up. Is there some downside to this, to not thinking about either individual group rights, society impacts, environmental impacts that are not framed around the human? Anyone who is involved?
I'll get technical.
Great. So basically, like, we have right now a lot of talk about ESG and sustainability. And I guess this very nicely fits into what you are mentioning, because we have also the idea of environmental sustainability and also an understanding that there is a right to clean environment, for example. And this in a way strikes this aspect, because we have obviously this kind of individual rights context, but obviously individual rights are also in a way shaped and also realized by conditions that we are facing in society. As we have seen that in the case of the pandemic, for example, where we have an external event, which is like a large scale social phenomenon, but we can also extend it to climate change in a way, and also impacting the realization of human rights. So I guess also this kind of integration, not just of human rights, but also of ESG topics in this debate are really important. And I guess basically looking and trying to find the right way to combine all concepts of human rights, of AI ethics, but also then sustainability and ESG into this frame makes a lot of sense. And perhaps we have here some sort of convergence through the EU taxonomy debate, which is right now a major focus.
That in practice, if from a company perspective, you need to run an ethics impact assessment, and there may be these kind of trade-offs, how to decide. I mean, we need to decide, otherwise we cannot really release a product or whatever.
And this is exactly the difficulty, because it puts companies, also from a human rights or legal perspective, because it puts companies into a situation where they need to navigate dilemmatic situations within human rights and within different normative concepts. And usually this has been basically the task of courts to do. So that's an interesting, and I guess that if we have more AI, we need to do many things up front.
Yeah. If I could add to that, I'm not sure if it's a new problem for companies somehow, is it? I mean, I was thinking about the first question where it was about this, like, do things converge? And I think this is always a struggle for companies, right? So you need to do engineering and it needs to be kind of having a business case, right? Because otherwise you don't make money and you're bankrupt. And it needs to also fulfill all the legal requirements. And on top of that, there's this, like, if you take that triangle, there's a kind of invisible force of what is opportune to do or not in a certain context. So, for example, when we did this open source stuff at BMW, we were always saying, well, let's not follow the law by the letter, but let's follow it by the spirit of what was intended by the people who came up with it. Because if people feel like you're tricking the system, that's also not a good thing. And I think what tricking the system is really not clear. So I'm happy that the EU is at least giving out a law, because that gives guidance. But then obviously, as so often, I feel like the private sector is a bit left with this task of figuring it out. And I don't think that's a new concept, unfortunately. And I don't think it's going to be any different here. So as somebody being in a corporate field, you will have to make this balancing act, and you will have to also sometimes overstep. For example, Wi-Fi hotspots in a car, when they were first pushed to the market, they were not considered to be legal by a lot of legal people in the companies, and yet the companies were starting to push for those. It was a gray area where most lawyers said, stay out of it, right? If, you can maybe do it, but the argument seems to be a bit screwed. And then companies did it nevertheless, and now it's kind of common standard. So unfortunately, I think that's not going to be any different for the discussion we have now.
Environmental topics, individual risk, and so forth, but they do not really operationalize this. Then a question of law and not just reputation.
Yeah. We had a question in the corner, and then I'll get to Lamek, and then I promise I'll let you all go get something to drink.
Thanks a lot. I really like this concept of Mario, of building a culture of ethical quality. My question would be, how do you get there? Of course, I guess education is the most obvious, but like, how do you actually incentivize people to want to get to a culture of ethical quality?
Yeah. That's a great question, indeed. So I can't tell you exactly how to do that. What I can tell you, though, is if you look at digital change and the whole topic of companies becoming more agile, I think what they were also trying to do by some extent is to incentivize a new culture, for example, I'm not sure if that's the right culture for AI, by the way, but this general idea of agility is, for example, to accept failure or embrace failure more, to come faster to working things. If you look at, for example, something like LESS, which is an agile scaling framework. So it tells you how to work agile with maybe 100 developers or something, right? So they have heavily looked into these Japanese Toyota type of approaches, which, for example, is something called Genba and stuff like that, which means, like, as a manager, you really have to go where people work and you have to look at what they're doing instead of kind of residing in a glass tower and having the factory across the street. No reference to any Munich companies, but I mean, in that sense, there are kind of structural elements to culture. For example, shaking somebody's hand, right? It is something you do, but it also influences how you see people, or borrowing in an Asian context. So I think there are actually structural elements to it, but then it also needs this realization that there's more than just structure, that it needs to be something that maybe you believe in, and because you believe in it, you will also convince other people that they believe in it. And that's why I brought this argument, because I think it's more than technicalities in the sense of do this, follow that standard, and so on. It's also this feeling for people to really care about it and not just say, yeah, well, yeah, you know, ethics, yeah, also important somehow. But to really believe in what you're doing. And I think that's, again, also something that we've seen totally outside of AI. If you, for example, look at Volkswagen and corporate culture questions that came up in that context, right? And I think it's a bit of a same type of issue here, very tricky to solve, but the first thing is to talk to people and to convince everybody that it's really worth the effort. I think that's
so I think this is a really important topic that you're bringing up, right? I mean, what makes people comply or do the right thing or understand? How do you get an organization of lots of different types of people to follow one train of thought, or the right train of thought, the one that the company wants you to live the ethics, right? Not just speak about it. And so there, I mean, when we talk about governance, when we talk about what that overall structure looks like, there are a lot of elements to that. So do you have the right mission? Do you have a strategy? Do you have a code of conduct? And are these just overarching principles that exist in paper in your organization, or do you live those principles, and how do you live them? Do you have the proper communication channels? Is there the right training material? Is that embedded into your operations rather than just an overall like a message from corporate or headquarters or something like this? So there are lots of things to actually help to build that culture within an organization.
Yeah, and maybe if I may add one sentence. I think very often these things are also generally believed to be the right thing to do, right? So companies spend a lot of effort, but for example, also there's a consensus that there should be quality in a product and it shouldn't endanger people. That's a society consensus basically, and it supports that activity within the companies, right? So yeah, I think it's where it maybe connects back to the global.
Yeah.
Hopefully that won't be after a scandal, but we have to train ourselves.
Yeah, I think this scandal is a good idea where maybe values where something that wasn't aligned to also values just happened, right? In that case, it was clearly that people thought, well, this is a wrong thing to do, but still, obviously there was some kind of disconnect. And I think we have this challenge to connect also AI to what we're actually doing and so on, like I tried to point out, right?
I'm going to take one last question.
Yeah, for me, it was just, and I love the discussion thus far, especially the interdisciplinary approach. I think we have to understand that, you know, human rights are intrinsically linked to capacity building. There's really a need for us to have an interdisciplinary approach to actually addressing some of these AI concerns. And for me as a software engineer, I always say that we are trying to address ethics, but we're trying to address it the wrong way, because in software engineering, we are software development processes. And even when we are developing AI systems, we use some of those processes like the agile development process, where we do the requirement solicitation and analysis, where we go to try to find what are the system requirements, then we go to design, then we go to test, and we go to deployment. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is how can we incorporate AI ethics into the life cycle so that when people are developing the systems, they are explicitly thinking about these things or the ethical concerns and requirements. And one thing that I wanted to ask was, what do you guys think about that approach where there are those explicit iteration where we must address AI ethics? And what the law should really do is about look at ways on how to actually enforce that within the code of conduct that we have in software engineering and etc. Thank you.
So maybe one wrap-up phrase from each person on how do we actually do it.
So actually, as we are working together on this, I agree with that, what you say. And I really liked that you pointed out also the right to development, because this is also a thing we often tend to forget. when we speak about individual rights, also addressing international imbalances when it comes to AI, and also AI solutions being tailored to specific groups of countries. So I think there's also to be added in a way to this wider look on social sustainability when embedding that in AI ethics.
Mario?
I think it's a great question. I think some of the aspects are addressed in IEEE 7000 and value-based engineering. And in that sense, this work is really visionary to me. I think it's really good. And one thing that I would like to point out is that agile methodologies often try to push as much as possible in the shortest possible time. And I think that's maybe not the right approach for the future if your product could be in the hand of 1 billion people within a month. I think that system didn't account for the question, what happens if you just use an incomplete system at scale? So maybe we have to find a new idea of how to think agile in the context of making sure that nobody gets hurt.
I got it. Well, he plugged the IEEE, so I don't have to. But obviously we have some great stuff. Beyond that, I would say AI literacy and ethics literacy is really important. I mean, we don't talk about it enough. In fact, it's only the UNESCO recommendation on AI that even talks about literacy as a part of this, which is kind of crazy because, as you've all seen today, perhaps, ethics is complicated and nebulous and conflicts with a lot of stuff that also seems to matter to people, and no one can really figure their way through it, right? So if we actually provided tools that are accessible to help people understand what we're even talking about, then we all have some common vocabulary to start this conversation off with. So for me, it's about literacy.
So here. No, I agree. But I also think that there's a lot of, I mean, with this whole ethics and design, I mean, the whole ethics by design, privacy by design, these are all right frameworks for design where you have to keep those elements in mind at every stage of that process. So I think it's a really good example of how this can be used in engineering. I mean, I see this quite hopefully. I think everyone here is probably hopeful, but I think there is a race. There's a consciousness, anyhow. I think in all the different interpretations of human rights and ethics and how organizations can embed all of these into their design, into their products and technologies. I think there's definitely an acknowledgement that this is necessary, and this is good, right? And I think that people are looking for solutions. What types of frameworks can we have? What checklists and assessment tools? And kind of everyone is working at collecting as much knowledge and tooling and support as they can, so that they can achieve what we're all, I think, aiming for, right? So that there is ethical design and technology that supports human rights. So I think this is very positive.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again to our panelists. Another big round. Thank you to the TUM think tank for hosting us. I want to tell you we have an event next week with our Responsible AI Africa network that we're working with on generative AI. That'll be online, so check our website for that. And also the Responsible AI Forum in September that I hope we all see you at. And please stick around for some drinks and chat more with our panelists. So thanks.